It was to be, could be used, using simple messaging service on your phone. How many people use Twitter this way? Are some people tweeting this way right now? Two of us. Okay. This is the first time anyone's raised their hand for that question. But of course, we don't need that constraint if we go using the web, if we use smartphones and have apps. But we have a 160 character limit on SMS, and of course, that's more than 140 characters, but we have a 15 character maximum that we can have for a Twitter handle, and then there's a colon and a space, and then there's actually a little bit of room left. That's only 157 characters, but early on, some of the messages, when you use the SMS interface and you wanted, before Twitter search, when you wanted to follow a tweet, you'd put parentheses around a handle, so that brought it up to 159. So there was a little wiggle room in there to do extra stuff. Of course, it wasn't until many years later that people thought about putting 3 pairs of parentheses around a Twitter name, but I'm not going to get into that. So then the question arises as to, well, why is it that we have a 160 character limit on SMS? And this is the guy who's responsible for that, Friedhelm Hillebrand, and he actually determined with one collaborator what the protocol for SMS was, and they had worked for a while. They had 128 characters that they could get. They figured out how to get a little bit more room. Of course, the bandwidth, the amount that they could get into the signal, was significant to this. But they also wanted to know, if this was a worthless amount, if no one was actually going to be able to write anything worthwhile, then they wouldn't bother, putting this protocol in place. So they needed to figure out, what's going to work? Is 160 characters going to work? How can we justify it? And so to do this, Hillebrand went and he looked at postcards, and people wrote postcards that used fewer than 160 characters very often. He also looked at telex exchanges. This is a late model print terminal. And saw that when people actually wrote to each other, they wrote things that were often of less than 2 lines. It's 80 column lines on here, which we'll certainly talk about some more. And then he typed out messages trying to see, would it be meaningful to write a very short message of this sort? And he did that on not this very typewriter, but some type of typewriter like it. This is a Selectrix. And so he had 80 columns here as well, which is half of 160. And looking at these, this also helps to explain the regularity with which we see a terminal like the VT100 here offering, also 80 characters width. Now, why are all these things 80 characters that may be factored into this 160 character decision with SMS? Well, it actually goes back to the punch card. 80 column punch card, and this is an example of the IBM card, which was developed in 1928. If you think about that, that's before computers of the sort that we think about today, general purpose digital electronic computers, right? But punch cards were used in tabulation. They were used in the 1890 census, in fact, earlier than this. And it was in 1928 that you could take a punch card of this sort and first use the full 80-column rectangular hole version that was developed by IBM. And of course, it could store anything. It could store numeric data, computer programs, or pornography, as we have here. This is the type of machine that you'd use in 1928. It doesn't look much like a computer or computer peripheral. And this is a system that would actually allow you to key punch these cards, enter data into them. And these machines, and there's a lot of this long mechanical profile leading up to the computing that we had in the batch processing era. And these machines were all set up and manufactured to take cards of a certain size. So in fact, when that 1928 card was developed, it was based on the size of an earlier card, one that Herman Hollerith developed in 1890. And originally, this card only had 45 holes wide. It was only 45 holes wide, and it had round holes. But they wanted to keep the card size because the machines were set up to use this, but they wanted to increase the amount of data. Okay, so we're now back around 1890, but we could actually go back earlier because we might also ask, where did this card size come from? Why is the card this particular dimension and this particular size? Well, it's not known exactly, but it's very close to the size of a U.S. dollar bill. This is this 1869 series bill, and so that would be handy because you could use the same sort of trays and machinery and containers that you might use to contain currency to also sort this. So we could also ask why the dollar bill is this size, but for now the buck stops here. And so here, we've gone back more than a century to look at issues like this. And I would just say that, tracing this back to the US dollar bill makes it very appropriate that when we open up a terminal window nowadays, right, and of course it's going to be 80 characters wide, and then cha-ching, we also get the dollar sign. So this question of, why is a tweet limited to 140 characters? Like, obviously, somebody made that decision. We could ask the people who are involved and figure out, like, what their thinking was. But there's actually a long story, and this huge, sort of iceberg of paper in this case, right? And the way that information is transmitted, the way text is inscribed. So that's what I'm going to be exploring today with relation to Rogue and roguelike games. And so one of the questions that I think is an interesting one to consider is, we look at this, and Rogue consists of these characters arranged in a rectangular grid, obviously, and that's pretty standard for all roguelikes. But why? Why a grid? Because if we go back to the 15th century, we see Johannes Gutenberg, right, actually putting together a 42-line Bible. This isn't in a grid. He has proportional type. Some of these letters are smaller, and some of them are wider, and some of them are narrower, right? So it's not just a given that, like, oh, that's how it was in ye olden days. No, actually, initially type was proportional, and then somehow it had to become grid-like. One of the ways was around 1800. People decided, this is digital type, this isn't letterpress type, but similar idea. People decided that, it'd be really handy if these numbers that we are using to, like, try to put things in tables, express, mathematical sums, what if they actually lined up? Like, because it's a real pain to like stick those little pieces of metal, to get this spacing right. So they said, well, let's just cast this type, lining type, tabular lining type, such that all of the numbers are the same width. And then you get to do really exciting stuff like this. Okay, there's tables of logarithms, which actually were very important to 20th century communication and 19th century communication, the way that a lot of scientific work was done. In fact, early computers, what did the ENIAC do? The ENIAC, first job was doing artillery firing tables like this, actually computing these that would later be printed and that people would look at. So it ties into the history of computing in a lot of different ways. And if we really want to say, what is to credit or blame for the grid being present in computing, I'd have to look at this familiar device right here, the typewriter. Okay, so this is a system that mechanically, it just is not plausible to have wider and narrower type for each individual key. Everything needs to advance by the same amount. The system needs to work uniformly, and this type of industrial production, that Mark Twain, a famous early user of it, Friedrich Nietzsche, another, like this type of system of the typewriter is what brought into ordinary use a regularized monospace grid. Beforehand, people had proportional type that they were looking at in books. They were writing notes that, had letters that were wider and narrower, but the typewriter actually changed that. Okay, so the typewriter it's this interesting system of uniformity, but then within that uniformity, there's transgression, there's variation. It's a system that worked in office environments and situations, and then also, it's a situation that was very, very important to computing because typewriters were the interfaces to computers for many, many years, just as punch cards, invented before computing, right, were also used in batch mode processing. So a system like this, an ASR33 teletype. Teletype is a brand name. The generic would be teletypewriter. So a system like this is it would allow you to program offline, and you could punch that paper tape, and you could take the paper tape in if you wanted. You could also connect. You could go online and actually use a computer. And you would get, of course, the output printed out for you, and you would be able to type on the typewriter keys. Now, interestingly, you can play adventure like this, and people did, but you can't play Rogue, right? So this is here. We're seeing like the reason that cursor addressability was a novelty at one point historically, like it was an idea that was so exciting, is because people have been using this. All the less fortunates who didn't have access to these fancy video terminals, right? We're still connecting sometimes, through the 1970s with systems like this, and then if you're lucky, of course, you got to use one of these, which, like the teletype, is also going to be 80 columns wide, but had additional capabilities to address the cursor. And then home computers also would have 80-column displays and grid displays. Often they'd be 40-column displays because they'd be designed to work with home television sets, and the resolution was not good enough, even though sometimes I put my Apple II into 80-column mode, excited that I had this capability. You can't read it for very long on a TV. You actually need a monochrome monitor like this. So people were all excited that we got to do this in 1984. We have Macintoshes. We get to do this. You could do this in the 15th century. It's not new, right? It's okay. All right. So this is a little bit about the history of the grid, and the typewriter is one of the major components. So related to this typewriter, then I want to talk about a little about ASCII art, but mostly about concrete poetry, which is very tied into the typewriter, and what this means, sort of in relation to Rogue. What people were doing as concrete poets that in any way was similar to the development of computer gaming on cursor addressable ASCII terminals. So Guillaume Apollinaire developed, an early example of what's understood as concrete poetry, where the rain is being described, but also the text is actually showing this representation of the rain. But the people who are most famous as concrete poets, probably there's 3 Brazilians, and then the author of this poem, Eugene Gomringer from Bolivia. And so it would present something like this. And here you can see one of the aspects of concrete poetry, which is you can read it in many cases. You can read it in a certain way. But if I read this out loud to you, you really wouldn't be getting the poem, right? You miss the point here. So it's something that visually, you need to apprehend, what's going on. And this is, in fact, though reading it out loud might be pretty interesting, because then everywhere it says silence, you'd be speaking, and the places where it doesn't say silence, you'd be silent. So there's an interesting way of engaging with language, engaging with the regularity and shape of the page. And so this is one of the ways that the Noigandes and other people working in concrete poetry created these very regular appearances. Now, however, this wasn't the only thing that was done. So I'm going to give an example of a Canadian concrete poet, Steve McCaffrey. This is work that he did around 1970. And this is one page of his Carnival, a 16-page piece that can be assembled into a panel, like this one, right? And in this piece, this is entirely created on a typewriter, but it's an example of what we call dirty concrete. So he moves the page around while it's actually on the platen, and he types in different orientations. He masks and only types part of the letter. Now, these are obviously things that we can't do in a straightforward way on a cursor addressable ASCII terminal like a VT100, right? But what he's doing is he's using the capabilities of the typewriter and the standard, red and black ribbons, right, to do something really quite spectacular. If you actually look, Carnival is a beautiful work. If you look at it, so many people look at it and think, well, this is a work of visual art. It's not a poem. It's something to hang on the wall. But actually, you can read it. It's legible if you pursue it closely. And you see this, Eve's ending ever. There's actually there are these characters, Adam and Eve. It's about the eviction from the garden. It's about gaining language and knowledge. And then you start to look and you say, oh, maybe the reason that the letters, A and E are the ones that are occurring in all these shapes has something to do with the fact that Adam and Eve are characters in here, And in fact, later on, the I comes in, maybe the serpent, right? So a very intriguing work, and it's also creating these sorts of spaces. Obviously you can't, run around in them and collect potions, but there are these sorts of spaces that are very strongly suggested. And when you put all this together, some of these spaces are more architectural, some of them, more undulant, but this looks like a dungeon map to me, and of a certain sort, right? So I think Carnival is a pretty amazing example, and the challenge I think for roguelike developers, would be what is it? How can you take your display technology of the computer, and do what Steve McCaffrey did to the typewriter? So another, this is interesting. This is actually not a concrete poem. This is just the beginning of a letter. This is how Dom Sylvester Huidar, wrote to Edwin Morgan, another concrete poet. And he did some amazing work. In fact, this is prior. This is from the 60s, earlier than Steve McCaffrey's work. So you can see this work of his, George, and the name George is in here. Again, you can see the type of dirty concrete technique that's being used. Really remarkable, innovative concrete poet. And he also created, even works like this, entirely on a typewriter. In fact, I don't believe this involves turning or, or changing the regularity of spacing, although there's these microspaces, left to right. He's typing left to right, much closer in some cases. But this is more, more Fez-like than roguelike, I think. It's an amazing sort of view of three-dimensionality using, I think, 2 characters on the typewriter. So, and also, by the way, Huidar was a monk. He's a Benedictine monk. Quite devoted to his vocation, So while he's doing all this work, maybe a different, not of the wizard character class that we would expect, but a different type of figure. So concrete poetry has already been exploring. By the time we get up to the late 1970s, the development of dungeon crawl and roguelike games has already been exploring these really radical ways to engage with how type and letters and characters can be made into these things that at least look like architectural spaces, or strange environments and landscapes. So ASCII art, I think, ASCII art is more focused on the particular representation. It's more in the visual art category. There's on the one hand we have ASCII art that's handcrafted, where people select these characters by hand and put them together, to symbolize certain things. And in another case, there's the dollar bill again. We have ASCII art that is maybe computer generated, right, and is the characters used to render things. But I don't think there's the same engagement with space and the letters being given different meaning. So when we move up, we see things that are happening in roguelikes. We see some of this depiction of space in a more rectilinear, more gridded way, even than the typewriter projects that come earlier. But one of the things we get to do, of course, in Rogue that we don't have the literal capability to do in a concrete poem is to explore, to navigate, right, to move around in this space. And that's something, we did have a way of doing that in Adventure. I think if we had a roguelike, if we were to develop some roguelike command shells, the Adventure shell would be sort of one model for this, because the navigability of that space and the understanding of information in spatial terms is very critical to it. And then another point, even though it's not rendered in ASCII graphics, Fusion, that's a Unix system. I know this. Is also an example where it's the rendering of this as landscape and making that landscape operable and connecting it to the things that you do with a computer is essential. So one of the points here is that if we look sort of at visual art and we look through the accomplishments that people have done in concrete poetry and so on, there are certainly precedents, even pre-computer precedents, ones that don't involve computers or involve games, in how space is represented. But I think Rogue's unique contributions are that we have the possibility for a boundless generation, for creating, not just a very bizarre handmade panel that presents a landscape, but endlessly generated landscapes that intrigue us, that make us think about underlying rules, and an interactive and explorable architecture. So I would look at that as what Rogue has done uniquely and interestingly. But then also I would say, maybe there's some challenges. Maybe we could step up to look, can we make a roguelike that is as amazing and stunning a work for the computer as Carnival is for the typewriter? An interesting thing to consider. So thanks. Be glad to take questions.
Just curious if you're aware of any roguelikes that are particularly pushing the boundary in terms of visual representation using ASCII, and if you'd call attention to any in particular.
So I guess I can't think of any that are doing it in the same way that concrete poets of the 20th century have. But one of the things that all sorts of roguelike games and all sorts of systems that appropriate, the ASCII character set and make it stand for something different than it's normally intended to do. They're suggesting like these dual levels. They're making us, question various things about the language we use. Why is, what's that @ sign doing as one of the standard? It wasn't even widely used early in the 20th century when it was devised, when it was added to Murray Code, right? So why is it, how is it that we we normally don't associate these characters, the letters A through Z with characters, with monsters, right? So I think that all sorts of systems that tend to defamiliarize the alphabet are making, and the other characters are making some interesting contributions, and they don't have to be as spectacular, although it would be cool if sometimes they were.
Well, we're sort of out of time, but you can ask your questions to Nick in person. He'll be around. Huge round of applause for Nick. Actually, you can probably answer that question while we change over the laptop. So we have to set up a new laptop. But I think we had, behind you, sorry.
Where is you've got it.
I'm just curious about computer-generated poetry. So when you design an algorithm for generating content, and then you look at the content and said, "Yeah, that's the thing I wanted," or "No, I need to go fix my algorithm because it doesn't make the thing that I wanted," what do you say about the poetry? It's like, yes, that's satisfying because it's like the text, or because it is different than the text. Just talk about that for a second. Thanks.
Yeah, ultimately, I wanted it to give some new perspective on reading and on text. And in fact, I very seldom think about what I'm doing as generating content, but rather as I think of that text as material, and so sometimes it's an interesting material to not just to see, not just for it to scroll by, but sometimes it's an interesting material to comprehend in this, to see in a mass, but also to sample and to look at. Sometimes, I have different goals. Sometimes I have tried to create, a computer-generated book made with 1 page of standalone Python code and no external data. That is good to read. That's actually worth reading. But it's not always my goal to create something that's worth reading. Sometimes I might try to exaggerate things about, existing text. Samuel Beckett's second novel, Watt, is incredible because I sometimes, explain to people that computers had to be invented because Samuel Beckett wrote Watt, because he has these permutational and very, very bizarre constructions. It's amazing to think someone, going through and doing that by hand or at all, actually. So sometimes I'm computer generating text to exaggerate that even further and make it even more outrageous. But I think there's a variety of points. I'm also trying to do things that people would never do in their human authored poetry. I'm not trying to imitate like, oh, here's a nice haiku. Isn't this beautiful? I'm trying to expand maybe the frontier of what writing and poetry could do.
Great. Thank you so much, Nick.